All right, Sober Open Mike, Sober Open Walsh, Patrick Michael Walsh, Walshy, Little Walshy. Just hopping in for a little detailed part of my story. So I've shared my story on YouTube here, and I've gone into some details around how I ended up in rehab and some of the addictive patterns in my life, and there's a lot of loose ends, and they don't need to be tied up, but I thought it might be valuable to explore them a little bit. And I had there's a vivid memory I have that's related to my father's car accident. And so my dad got into a car accident on January 5th of 2013. And I can tell this story in detail, but I'll give you a high-level version. I was drinking probably rum and Cokes, rum and Diet Pepsi at the time, because for some reason, Diet Pepsi and rum was better as a diabetic. And my sister sent me a text. And she sent me this text. It was about 10 o'clock at night, and my dad got off work, and he would drive from Whitecourt, Alberta to Mayerthorpe, Alberta. And, you know, my dad always did the speed limit. So that's one thing about Pat Walsh. He always did the speed limit, you know, and he was on time. And he communicated. He had a little cell phone that he used to text my mom basically only when it came to him being late, or if he was going to pick up groceries or something in IGA where he worked. And my dad was 5 minutes late, and my mom was starting to freak out. And my sister was texting me, and I took the line of, hey, it's going to be fine. Everybody calm down. No big deal. And then a few minutes later, I got a second text from Kate that was like, hey, it's 20 after, you know, it's 20 after 10, and we haven't heard from Dad. And I remember this feeling in my stomach. You know, I'd had a few drinks, but there was something that was off. There was an intuition that this wasn't right. My dad, like I said, did the speed limit. He was always on time. There's no way he'd be 20 minutes late without contacting someone. And so my sister and my mom got into a car, my sister's car, and they drove up to the intersection in Mayerthorpe. And I still remember my sister calling me from that car and saying, hey, there's sirens. It's small town Mayerthorpe, right? So we knew people in the emergency personnel group, right? We knew the firefighters. Sometimes we even knew the policemen. And I remember knowing at that point that my dad had been in an accident, right? And I remember my mom was going to go up to the accident scene, and I had to take the phone from my sister, I had to tell my sister, like, aggressively to give the phone to my mom. And so my sister gave the phone to my mom, and I remember yelling at my mom fiercely, like, Anne, you cannot go up there. You cannot go up to the accident scene, right? You have to go to my grandparents' house. And so my grandparents lived in our small town right across from the hospital. So Mom and Kate got in the car, went to the hospital. And by the way, I'm just going with this story. This wasn't my original intention on this video, but here we are. So I still remember Mom and Kate go to Grandma and Grandpa's house, and then Dad gets driven to the hospital. And so Mom goes to the hospital, gets to see him briefly, and they put him on Stars Air ambulance. And I'm in Edmonton, and I'm driving at like 150K an hour, buzzed, unfortunately. And Mom, Kate, calls me and says, hey, they're flying him into Edmonton. And so I turn around and I head to the U of A. And I still remember parking at the U of A in the emergency department. And I parked there, and I went in, and I was waiting in the emergency room, and he came off the helicopter. And I didn't see that part, but I saw his, like, it was almost like a transparent body bag, right? Like a plastic white transparent body bag. And he came off, and I remember seeing him all bloodied and injured. But there was a doctor there, and the doctor came and he said words that I will never forget, ever. No life-threatening injuries. He's like, are you the son? Are you the family? Are you the son? And I'm like, yes. What's going on? And he's like, there's no life-threatening injuries. And so when your father's been in a car accident, and when you're, like, as a layperson, as a non-medical professional, no life-threatening injuries is like, hey, this is great, cool, perfect. What are we looking at here? Maybe a week of inconvenience? Like, no big deal. We're good to go. And I'll never forget those words, because those words would start a 2-year period of expectation, disappointment, misunderstanding around medical terminology. So my dad ended up in a coma for 6 weeks. He ended up with a serious brain injury, serious rehab. He was in the Glen Rose Rehabilitation Center. He was in Pinoca at the Centennial Center. He was back in Mayerthorpe and died 2 years later, essentially of pneumonia. And he had compromised kidneys and liver, which kind of led to that being a more serious outcome. But there's a couple moments in the story, and one of the biggest thoughts that comes up for me right now is how the feeling after this accident happened, the next day waking up and thinking it was a dream, all the moments in the U of A, and just, it was the type of thing that always happens to someone else, right? It happens to someone else. Accidents happen to other people. Tragedy happens to other people, but it was happening to us. And I'll never forget, there was this moment a few weeks in, maybe a week or 10 days. Mom had stayed in the city. So her good friend Diane, who was a lifesaver and still is one of the greatest friends in our life, for sure, easily, Diane and Pat Hagman, the greatest friends, truly. Diane had driven Mom in, and I think Kate went home and got a car or something, and then Mom had the car. But long story short, Mom and I drove out to Mayerthorpe to pick up a vehicle. And we went to my grandparents' house, okay? And I will truly never forget a very specific moment in this story. And this relates a bit to my drinking and my addictions. And I want to start by saying I absolutely love my grandfather. So my grandfather, my mom's dad, retired in 1997, moved to Mayerthorpe, Alberta, and we used to golf every single day together because I homeschooled. And so Grandpa became basically a second father figure in my life because of all the time we spent together. And so I'm driving back to Mayerthorpe with Mom. We get to Grandma's house, right? And I remember we got inside and Mom was just a wreck. I think it was the first time she'd seen her mom and dad since this accident had happened. And I remember seeing Mom crying, and I took my hand and I smashed the door to the basement at Grandpa's house. And I remember this vividly because I smashed this door and my grandma was sitting at her desk and she didn't flinch. Like, I still remember her just sitting there not flinching, looking at me. And like my entire life, if I had done something like that, kicked something, accidentally spilt a glass of water, whatever, my grandma would have reacted, right? That she was very particular about things. But in this moment, it was just obvious that something tragic had happened and that I had legitimate rage, you know? And I remember my grandpa calling me. I was at my house, and it was a few days after Dad's accident, and he called me to talk about it. And I remember him saying, and I was drinking at the time, and I think he was drinking too, and I remember him saying that it would be I would have a right to drink, or I would have it would be okay if I drank, or if I took one night and just tied one on, as it were. He didn't use that expression, but like, he was trying to give me permission to somehow let out all of these feelings that I had through alcohol. And now Grandpa's not doing anything that most people don't do or think or say in that type of scenario, right? When tragedy happens, we all expect someone might turn to a substance, at least briefly. But I still remember that moment. I remember sitting on my sectional. This is in 2013. This would be in early January, and Grandpa saying that I might need to just have a few drinks and just let it out, right? And then a second incident occurred, which was more powerful, which was when we were in Marathorpe at my grandma's house, picking up a car. I had driven my mom. She was visiting with Grandma upstairs. I was downstairs in the basement with Grandpa. And I'll never forget, we were drinking spiced rum. He used to buy spiced rum because I like spiced rum. And he didn't used to always fill my glass up. But on this occasion, he continued to just keep filling my glass up, right? And there was this, I can still feel this. There was a sense of despair that this was a problem. This was a problem that he couldn't solve. And most of my life, my grandpa was, he was very successful. He was a banker, very generous guy, a lot of community awards he won. And he would never let you buy anything. He was always paying for supper, paying for lunches, paying for things, right? He helped his kids buy homes and all of this, but he could always solve some of these difficulties with money. And I love you, Grandpa, but I remember getting that sense of like, here's a father figure in my life who doesn't know how to cope with a lack of control and with the sadness of not being able to help his daughter, which is all reasonable. But we were drinking, and it was like his ability to pour me multiple drinks in that moment wasn't what I needed. And I still remember that moment of like, Grandpa doesn't know what to do. And so the person that I would turn to for advice so often, he didn't know what to do. And so I'm struck by that story because it's just a vivid image for me. It's a vivid image of loss of control, which could happen to anyone in this scenario. He couldn't help his daughter. Her husband was in a coma at the U of A, and he had his grandson, and he couldn't help. And so that's what I'm thinking of today. Is how that reflected in me and potentially reflected in my approach to alcohol and my approach to what to do when I'm losing control, or when I have perceived tragedy, or when I have stress. How has that image stayed with me? By the way, I have many great memories as well where Grandpa gave me advice, taught me things. We played cards together, we golfed together, all of this. But in that moment, think of me, think of Michael. So Grandpa played this fatherly role in my life. We homeschooled, right? They moved in 1997 to Marathorpe. I golfed with him every damn day in the summer. I worked at the golf course. It was beautiful, right? I worked at the golf course. We golfed every single day. And, you know, we played cards, we played pool, we did stuff together. And now my dad's in a coma. And on top of that, my second father figure is just pouring me drinks and has lost his ability to cope. And so I just wanted to share that because I realized that it's really impacted me. It impacted me back then. I have many more thoughts on the story about my dad, and just sharing that accident and how it all impacted me. You know, Dad was, as I said, he was in a coma, and then in Mayerthorpe, and then he was in the Glen Rose. I used to live in Westmount, and so if you know Edmonton, Westmount is very close to the Glen Rose Rehabilitation Center. And when my dad was there, he, as I've said, he wasn't himself, but I was 2 minutes away, and so I went out and I bought this brand new Mercedes after my DUI. My DUI was in April of 2013, and I totaled a Corolla. I went and bought a new Mercedes, because why wouldn't you? Very foolish of me. It was a nice car though. And I would drive in the Mercedes to go see Dad, and I couldn't visit him because I would go in and spend a few minutes, and he would yell for the nurse, and he would just have this like blank look in his eyes. He was completely gone, almost completely gone, and struggling, and I didn't know how to be around him. And it was so hard. And sometimes I look back and I wish I had more strength to spend time with him, because he was so close, and then I would lose my license later that summer and not be able to visit him. I love you, Dad. So as I just reflect on these moments with the accident with my dad, and then my own addiction story, my sobriety story, my recovery story, I just see where the father figures in my life were kind of taken away all at once. Like it was a clean sweep. You know, and later other people would jump in. My Uncle Jim jumps in and gives me a lot of help, and my Uncle Phil shows up and is a very good, strong role in my life. But in that moment, the people I'd looked up to were gone. And that's my reflection. Sober Open Walsh, going deeper on the loose ends. Cheers.